you, Nancy. If Beatrice, if you'll just wave so everyone knows who you are. You are in Fort Lauderdale, and she has the magic button that mutes everyone and keeps everything organized. So thank you, Beatrice. And Nancy's in Connecticut. She's going to be moderating this master class. And I'm Susie Ellis, and I'm just going to do a very quick personal introduction of Dan Buettner. I'm in Miami, and I met Dan Buettner at Lake Nona when you first spoke there, Dan, and I've heard him speak several times. It is always a privilege to listen to him speak because he has so much great information, and he's also quite entertaining. But I did want to just share one personal thing that has touched me a great deal. I have read all of his books, and this is just the one I pulled off my bookshelf here. The blue zones, the whole concept, I think, is so close to what we at the Global Wellness Institute, whose mission is empowering wellness worldwide, and the summit, whose mission is joining together, shaping the future. It is so aligned. And in particular, what I loved of everything you've written, Dan, is when you talk about it, and maybe you'll talk about it today, but it very much, it's all, well, you'll hear from Dan what it's all about, but you talk about how the people in the blue zones, the centenarians, aren't trying to be healthy. That is, to me, a big key for all of us in this world to recognize. They are not trying to be healthy. They are healthy because of so many factors around them. That's where I think we need to get in the wellness world. So the whole idea of self-discipline, goes out the window. And I think that's an exciting next step. So Dan was with us in Italy when we knew that we were going to do the summit in Italy. And we knew that Italy was the first place to have a blue zone, and that's a whole nother story that maybe Dan can tell. It was our honor to have him and Dr. Pez, who was one of the founders of the first, identifier of the first blue zone in Sardinia, was there, and we had them both on stage. And I think that made a huge impression for our whole industry. So Nancy, over to you, and then over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Susie, and welcome everybody. Before I introduce Dan, I'm going to give you just a couple of quick logistics on the Zoom call, as I always do if you've been with us before. Beatrice has muted everybody. With a group this size, it's very important for background noise to stay muted so that you can hear Dan and not background noise from all of us. In order to see as many people as possible on your screen at once, the top right of your Zoom window offers you the gallery view, and that gives you this sort of gorgeous global mosaic of faces. But when Dan is speaking, I would urge you to choose the speaker view, which would make Dan much more prominent on your screen. And you'll want to do that, I think. Because there's so many people on the call, if you want to find your friends, in the middle of the Zoom window on the right, there's an arrow, a blue arrow. And if you click on that, you can scroll through the many, many pages of faces. The chat window, which is already very active, if you haven't been to Zoom before, the bottom center of your Zoom window gives you a chat icon. When you click that, it opens a window to your right. And that's where you can post comments and, more importantly, post questions. I'll be looking at that, as will Susie, throughout the call, and we will pull questions for Dan and ask them that way. That keeps the cadence of the call much more on track and allows many more questions to get to Dan. The recording of this will be posted and shared on our website. Many people have asked. So you can share with your colleagues after that. Now it's a distinct pleasure to introduce Dan Buettner. Dan's resume is nearly as long as his 15,500-mile world record for distance cycling. He's a Renaissance man for the modern age, for sure. Dan discovered 5 places in the world where people lived the longest, healthiest lives, and then brought that information to the world. And the ripple effect of that has been profound, and that's what he's going to talk about with us today. He now works in partnership with municipal governments, large employers, health insurance companies to implement Blue Zones projects in communities, workplaces, and universities. Blue Zone projects are well-being initiatives that apply the lessons from the Blue Zones to entire communities, much of what Susie was referencing, by focusing on changes to the local environment, public policy, and social networks. The program has dramatically improved the health of more than 5 million Americans to date. And I'm sure those of you on the call from all over the world very much hope Dan will be bringing these projects to your countries as well. Dan's an author, a public speaker, and clearly a fan favorite, judging by the numbers today. His newest book, The Blue Zone's Kitchen, 100 Recipes for Living to 100, is a New York Times bestseller, and it fuses scientific reporting, National Geographic photography, and 100 recipes that may help you live to be 100. Let's hope we all get that book. Blue Zones was recently acquired by Adventist Health in a move to redefine healthcare in America. Maybe Dan will talk about that. As Susie mentioned, he spoke at our summit in Italy, and he described the feeling of being in front of our delegates like getting a huge global group hug. And Dan, I really hope you feel that way today too. Dan Buettner.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm sending you back a huge telephonic hug this morning from Minneapolis. Not quite as exotic as Italy, but it's an honor to be here and a thrill to talk to so many countries. Since ill health is the news of the day, I thought what I'd do today is talk about health, about achieving it for the long run. And of course, my approach is identifying the world's statistically healthiest and longest lived people, and then distilling their lessons. And I thought I'd start out probably 15 minutes or so with a group of series of National Geographic images. Those of you who were in Italy will have seen most of these, but it gives the foundation. And Susie spoke to it a little bit, but there's a counterintuitive conclusion to 15 years of work, which is then applicable not only to individuals' lives, but also to cities and communities. We're in 50 of them right now, and even resort properties, which we've just sort of began working with. But it also has a lot of relevance to COVID. And we'll get into these sort of sub-themes in the question and answer. But first, for those people who haven't seen it, I'm just going to quickly run through sort of our genesis, the Blue Zone genesis story. And for that, I'm going to toggle over to my keynote and start here. And I assume that's visible, Nancy?
Yes, perfect.
All right. So the idea behind Blue Zones began with a National Geographic project and a National Institutes on Aging funded study that set out to, in a sense, reverse engineer longevity. So we found the statistically longest lived parts of the world. And again, these are the people who've achieved the outcomes we want. They lived a long time without chronic disease. And then we recruited a team of experts who could help us find the correlations or the things that explain longevity in all these disparate parts of the world. So think of it as finding the common denominators. And we found 9 of them, and then one overarching principle. And I'm going to articulate all those, but because I have the advantage of National Geographic photography, I thought I'd quickly take you to some of these blue zones. And I noticed that there are several people in the audience that live in or near some of these blue zones. So it might be fun for people to see their home here. But the original one, as Dr. Pass articulated at the conference in Italy, was in Sardinia, the highlands of Sardinia, a cluster of 14 villages, about 70,000 people, the original blue zone. And that was a population of largely shepherds and their families who, did maybe a very slight genetic advantage, but mostly low intensity physical activity, a fanatic zeal for the family, this notion of keeping older people nearby and making them part of the family. On the other side of the planet, in Okinawa, Japan, we had found the highest concentration of female centenarians in the world, about 30 times more female centenarians than you'd expect to see in a similar cohort here in the United States. Their diet explains some of it, highest consumption of tofu and turmeric in the world. But we focus more on these rather counterintuitive things like, 20% of Americans suffer loneliness, which shaves about 8 years off their life expectancy. In Okinawa, at an early age, children are put into these committed social circles called moais, and they travel through life together, mutually supporting each other. And the reason I take this picture is these 5 ladies have belonged to the same moai for 97 years. Their average age is 102. No word for retirement in Okinawa. This artificial punctuation between your useful life and then your life of repose. Instead, ikigai, the reason for which I wake up in the morning, or purpose, infuses their entire adult life. And people are really top of the mind, cognizant of what their life meaning is, and they're putting it to work daily. Makes a much bigger difference than we realize. In the United States here, about 120 kilometers southeast of Los Angeles, California, Loma Linda, California, we found the highest percentage of Adventists in the world. Adventists are conservative Christians who distinguish themselves from other Christians in that they celebrate their Sabbath on Saturday instead of Sunday, and they evangelize with health. But they've also been very rigorously studied by the National Institutes on Health or studies funded by the National Institutes on Health. Life expectancy for women in America is about 80, but for Adventist women, they're living 9 years longer, and for the men, it's about 11 years longer. So think about that for a moment. This is a bunch of Americans living by the Del Taco and the Wiener Hut, and somehow they're living 10 years longer than the rest of us. And my job as an investigative reporter was to piece together the explanation. So I embedded with the Adventists for 6 different times, and I noticed 24 hours every week, they shut down. They spend 24 hours on their Sabbath focusing on their religion, their church. They do potluck dinners, reinvigorate their social network, actually their lunches on Saturday noon, and then Saturday afternoon, hardwired right in their scriptures. It calls for a nature walk, the definition of which has evolved over the decades, but nevertheless, like clockwork, not just for a few weeks or a few months, but for decades or a lifetime, they're getting some physical activity every Saturday afternoon. They take their diet directly from the Bible. Genesis chapter 1, God talks about providing the diet of the Garden of Eden being all the trees that bear fruit and all plants that bear seeds. So Adventists are mostly vegetarian or vegan. So hint there. And Adventists tend to hang out with other Adventists. And we now know that health behavior is contagious, like catching a cold. What you eat, how you feel, your habits are very much a function of who you're hanging out with. And Adventists tend to hang out with other Adventists who revolve around plant-based eating and spirituality and their Saturday walk. So the positive contagion there. I like to tell the story about Ellsworth Wareham, a 97-year-old physician who has got all the money he needs, but when a contractor wanted $6,000 to build a privacy fence, he's like, well, for that kind of money, I'll do it myself. And they spent the next 3 days as we followed him around shoveling cement and hauling timbers. And on the 4th day, he ended up in the operating room, but not as the open heart patient at 97. That's Ellsworth on the left doing open heart surgery at age 97. Ed Rawlings, a 107-year-old cowboy, starts his day with the swim, spends the weekends on the boards, as he says. And then my dear friend, 105-year-old Marge Jaton, who wakes at 6:30, reads her Bible, eats her oatmeal, then pumps iron, rides her bike, and jumps in her Cadillac, where she still volunteers for 7 different organizations. Our 4th blue zone we found in what was previously a third world country not too long ago, very near where the Contras were active in the 1980s. But we found a population in the Nicoya Peninsula with the lowest rate of middle-age mortality in the world. That means they're reaching an age 92 or 93, which is kind of the maximum average life expectancy, without heart disease, diabetes, certain types of cancers and dementia or obesity. So they have what we want. They live a long time and stay sharp to the very end. And the all-stars of staying sharp to the very end, Ikaria, Greece, right off the coast of Turkey. You can see Bodrum almost across the Aegean Sea there. But Ikarians not only have about half the rate of cardiovascular disease as Americans do, they live about 8 years longer, but also 1/5 the rate of dementia that we do in the United States. So they really do stay sharp to the end. They've been isolated largely. There's no natural ports there. So most of Western civilization left them alone to incubate their own lifestyle and environment. We found, interestingly, the things that most correlate with longevity here was consumption of herbs, many of which were anti-inflammatories and diuretics. But also interesting, we found that the pitch of their village predicted their longevity. In other words, if you live in a steep place, you're more likely to live longer. Things we don't think of. And like all blue zones, people in Ikaria into their 90s, even 100s, continue to garden, which is the epitome of a blue zone activity because it's sort of a nudge. You plant the seeds, you're going to be nudged out for the next 3 or 4 months to water it, weed it, harvest it, and when you're done, you're going to eat an organic vegetable, which you presumably like because you planted it. So no matter where you go in the world and you see long-lived people, statistically longest lived, they're not exercising. This is a disruptive thing, and I've been scolded several times for this, but I'll tell you, in America anyway, the notion of exercise has been an unmitigated public health failure. We continue to hound people to go out and get their exercise, yet fewer than 20% of Americans get the minimum 30 minutes of physical activity a day. It's not working. What works, it seems, in blue zones is that if you live in one of those places, every time you go to work, every time you go to a friend's house, every time you go out to eat, every time your kids go to school, it occasions a walk. They don't have every mechanized convenience to do all their housework and their yard work and their kitchen work. They're still kneading bread by hand, doing work with hand tools. And they have a garden. So what this produces is a day where you're nudged into movement every 20 minutes or so. It's not this folly that you can sit in your desk for 8 hours and think you're going to go to the gym every night. In reality is you maybe go twice a week if you look at national data. That's not how we evolved as humans. In blue zones, it's natural movement every 20 minutes, but you're not even thinking about it. Similarly, they shed stress, not because it's a Bing on their app, but because they have sacred daily rituals that slow them down and reverse the chronic inflammation that comes with being stressed. They start their morning with prayer, like the Adventists do. They take a few minutes, like in Okinawa, of remembering their ancestors. The Ikarians and Costa Ricans take a nap. It's proven to lower the rate of cardiovascular disease if you're napping about 20 minutes a day. And the Sardinians do happy hour, which is the practice I've adopted. They have vocabulary of purpose. I mentioned how important that is. People with a strong sense of purpose live about 8 extra years than people who are rudderless in life. And people born in places like Okinawa and Costa Rica, there's actually vocabulary for purpose, like ikigai. When it comes to what they eat, this is what most Americans tend to like to hear about. Good news here, from what I observed at the Wellness Summit, they drink a little bit, which isn't to say if you're not drinking now that you should start, but there's plenty of evidence in blue zones that a couple glasses a day, especially with friends and with a meal, is probably protective, probably lowers your mortality. Susie mentioned the book Blue Zone's Kitchen. It looks like a cookbook, but it's really the result of 7 years of work, a meta-analysis of all 5 blue zones, what they've eaten for the past 100 years, 155 dietary studies done throughout the decades. If you want to know what a centenarian ate to live to be 100, you have to know what they were eating as children, middle-aged adults, and at the end of their life. You can't just ask them what you've been eating lately because they don't remember. If If you want to see the real centenarian diet, here it is. They're eating 90 to 100% plant-based food, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And by the way, it's very high carbohydrates. The problem with that word carbohydrates is it's almost meaningless because both jelly beans and black beans are carbohydrates. Obviously, the Blue Zone diets is more the black bean diet. Whole grains, we find them in every Blue Zones. I know there's a lot of controversy around grains, but I'll tell you, in every Blue Zones, they're eating daily. Greens, tubers like potatoes, sweet potatoes, a handful of nuts as a snack, and the longevity all-star food is beans. If you're eating about a cup of beans a day, it's probably worth an extra 4 years of life expectancy. They do eat meat, but it's a celebratory food, fewer than 5 times per month, portion no bigger than the size of a deck of cards. So a little bit of meat is fine. A lot less fish than you might think in these Blue Zone diets. They actually live inland, near the sea, but inland far enough that it's too inconvenient to get fish. No cow's dairy, which isn't to say they don't enjoy cheese once in a while, but when they eat cheese, it tends to be very high quality goat cheese like feta or pecorino. And again, it's a little piece, about half the size of an ice cube, with a big piece of bread. And it's very rich and not the, melt a half a kilo on a pizza type cheese. And then finally, when they're drinking 6 glasses of water, tea, good news for most of us, coffee in the morning, and then a glass of wine or so with meals. And then more importantly, perhaps, than what they eat, what they don't eat, their strategies to keep from overeating. They take their electronics out of their kitchen. They breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And they tend to eat all of their calories in an 8-hour window, leaving 16 hours for their digestive systems to rest. They tend to put family first, taking care of their aging parents, investing in their spouse, investing in their children. They tend to belong to a faith, which doesn't just mean they're spiritual. It means they show up 4 times a month. It's worth 4 to 14 extra years of life expectancy, by the way. And probably the most actionable thing for people on this call right now, the thing that really works for the long run, is curating your social circle, the 4 or 5 people you let into your inner circle. We know that if your 3 best friends are obese, there's a 150% better chance you'll be overweight. If your friends drink too much or do drugs or are lonely or are even unhappy, that's all contagious. So what's the prescriptive here? Carefully select 3 or 4 friends who, number one, their idea of recreation is something active. It could be walking, gardening, biking, sailing, whatever it is. Number 2, they care about you on a bad day. They're not just your business associates, but they're people who you can call and cry and say, I need your help, and they will care. That is the metric of being a true friend, and the metric of loneliness if you don't have people like that in your life. And third, it's not a bad idea to have a vegan or vegetarian in that inner circle so they influence you to eat right. So a lot of people look at this pyramid and say, well, it sounds like common sense to me, but it's not common sense. Fewer than 15% of Americans live a lifestyle anywhere near this. Instead, we spend a lot of time and money on diets and supplements and exercise program, over $100 billion a year. And while they're not bad ideas, and they occasionally work in the short run, they fail universally in the long run. You get 100 people on a diet today, you're going to lose 10% in 3 months. You're going to lose 90% in 7 months, and you're going to lose all of them, almost all of them, in 2 years. Same with exercise programs. They start with a lot of zeal after the holidays. People run out of gas by September. And even if I'd found a drug guaranteed to reverse aging, Americans wouldn't take it long enough to make a difference. So if these things don't work, what does? Well, there are very clear lessons from the Blue Zones. That people in Blue Zones are eating a wise diet, plant slant diet, largely, and they're moving naturally 20 minutes every 20 minutes or so, because their life is underpinned with purpose. They have curated the right tribe around them, and they live in places where the healthy choice is the easy choice. And the real secret to Blue Zone doesn't necessarily lie in these circles. It lies in the interconnected, mutually supporting web that keeps these clusters together, keeps people doing the right thing and avoiding the wrong thing for long enough that they don't develop heart disease or diabetes or obesity or cancers of the digestive tract or dementia. And as Susie said at the very beginning, the big insight to all these blue zones is that people here never pursued health. They don't join gyms. They don't get an elliptical. They don't call an 800 number looking for some magic supplement. They have no idea how they live so long. They just live their life. And the big insight, the big epiphany of these blue zones is that health, or at least long-lasting health, is very rarely successfully pursued. It ensues. It is the result of setting up your surroundings in the right way, that you are constantly, ubiquitously nudged into doing these things you see on your screen here. So that's the insight. And with that, I will turn it over to Nancy, and we can take questions, and we can talk about what's on your mind.
Dan, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, terrific overview. Maybe you'll stop sharing your screen so that we can see you again. Okay. Would be great. And I think one of the things that has come up, and that would be, I know is a great story, could you tell us how you got involved in this? How did this become your life? And can you tell us how the Blue Zones got its name?
I've been a lifelong explorer, beginning with those ultra long bike rides. And then I started a company that led an online audience of mostly young people, direct a team of National Geographic explorers and scientists to solve mysteries around the world. And we focused on the disappearance of the ancient Maya and human origins in Africa. And we followed, and I believe proved, that Marco Polo never went to China. But I got very good at solving scientific mysteries by collaborating with enormous online audiences, sort of harnessing the wisdom of the crowd. And in the year 2000, we read a very interesting study from the World Health Organization that showed that Okinawa had the longest disability-free life expectancy in the world. And I thought, aha, now there's a good mystery. And we did a very quick, rapid exploration of Okinawa. And I could tell it was going to be a successful pursuit, and sought the funding from the National Institutes on Aging to do the demographic work, and the partnership from National Geographic. I find it's really important, so it's not just sort of a facile study. We spent about 2.5 years really doing the foundational work of making sure these places were statistically longest lived. And then you can draw valid conclusions instead of, people, there's all kinds of new agers who go to the Vilcabamba Valley of Ecuador and the Hunza Valley of Pakistan, the Shangri-La, and the Caucasus. But the thing is, those people either didn't know their ages or lying about their ages. The real Blue Zone was originally identified by Dr. Gianni Pes in Sardinia, Italy. He was a physician who interviewed over 300 centenarians in the Nuoro province of Sardinia. And he noticed the concentration there was several orders of magnitude greater than the rest of Italy or even the rest of Sardinia. And I happened to be searching for blue zones and met Gianni Pes in early 2003. And we've been partners and friends ever since. And he, along with Michel Poulon, the Belgian demographer, the three of us have been the team that's gone out and found and verified the rest of the blue zones over the past. And we're, by the way, we have one more that we will be revealing in National Geographic sometime next year. Probably the last one, by the way.
And how did Blue Zones get its name?
I'm sorry you asked that, didn't you? Gianni Pes, when he was going through the archives to identify centenarians that lived in different villages. He would make a blue check mark on a map. And in the Nuoro province, there were so many blue check marks denoting centenarians. It was just one blue blob. So he said, that's the blue zone. And it's nothing more sophisticated than that. It wasn't any special gas or, people had blue hair or something. It was a blue check mark.
And
We're just
so
glad
much
he
better
didn't use
than
red ink.
and so much better than blue blob.
Yeah.
Dan, a lot of people are wondering, in this current era of COVID, how has this impacted those zones? What about the isolation? What about the emotional and mental impact of that on those particular places? Have you been talking to them? How has that had an impact?
Yes, I don't know all blue zones, but I'm tracking it carefully in Ikaria, Sardinia, and Costa Rica, and I can tell you the mortality rate there is much lower. The one thing you have to understand that this COVID, trying to stop it is like stopping the wind. 60 to 70% of us will be infected before we hit herd immunity, and that's true in the blue zones too. But a couple things are different. First of all, old people are treasures. They're like natural, UNESCO World Heritage sites in these blue zones. So they are really locked down, at least the ones I know. And they may avoid it for long enough before we get some sort of a treatment. So lower mortality rates. But the bigger point blue zones offers us when it comes to COVID is the world's hair is on fire with this disease. And in the United States alone, I don't know world statistics, but we're likely to hit 800,000 deaths. And that's a terrible tragedy in the next year. But guess what? 5 million people will die of a chronic disease. And somehow we're not paying attention to that. And chronic diseases are way more avoidable than infectious diseases are. The number one risk factor in the world for getting COVID for people under 55 is obesity. And obesity is almost completely avoidable. We don't think it's avoidable, but in blue zones, over time, the average obesity rate was less than 2%. Not because these people have better genes than we do, but because they have better surroundings, better environments. So the big lesson here in my mind, if we want to avoid all disease, especially chronic disease, but by association, collaterally, and even infectious diseases like COVID, is you follow these blue zones principles. You surround yourself with the right kind of people. You eat mostly a plant-based diet. You understand your sense of purpose and you live it in your work and your play. And you try to live in a place, or at least recreate it. Well, ideally live and work in a place where you are constantly nudged into moving more, eating less junk food, ultra-processed food, socializing more with the right kind of people, and living out your purpose.
Purpose is such a huge part of this, and it's really quite incredible how these people have, just lived their lives. How do they feel about the attention that this work has shown, sort of spotlights on these places? Do they have a reaction to being blue zones and being in the, top of mind in these kinds of conversations?
Yes, they're very proud of it. I know in Costa Rica, there's the government has afforded certain protections, not just as sort of a tourist site, but actually there's more funding for older people now, which thrills me to no end. So they're actually recognizing the treasure they have and investing in them. In all blue zones, they've become, they've created it's almost a new genre of health tourism. I've myself been on plane loads of people to Ikaria to experience the blue zone experience. And the problem is a little bit, it's hard to scale that because the real blue zone experience, for the most part, takes part in tiny little villages in people's homes. It's hard to get it in restaurants. Though there are places like Borgo and Gancia that's built a blue zone that's we worked with, and Thea's Guest House in Ikaria, and several places in Nicoya, Costa Rica, who especially in an area called Nosara, that have really embraced blue zone concepts of moving natural, eating plant-based, and tried to give people a taste of it. So I fear a little bit, though, as too many tourists arrive in these blue zones, that they'll bring with them their taste for junk food. And, you know, blue zones, by the way, is not a spa. It's not, you know, spas have tried to kind of co-opt the idea. Blue zones is not about sitting and getting a facial or a massage. Blue zones is about moving yourself. It's about yoga and meditation. It's about stopping this incessant quest for comfort and convenience. That's what's gotten us in trouble. That's why too many of us are overweight and we don't really have a purpose-driven life. In blue zone, there's an element of you're kind of always pushed a little bit, but you're pushed in an environment of purpose. You're pushed in an environment where you're doing something for your family. You're pushed in a healthful way that's made up for by the wonderful feeling you feel at the end of the day after you've been moving and you're around people you love. And those are the big blue zone lessons.
Dan, I mean, clearly everyone who's on this call and everyone who knows anything about this want to live the way people in blue zones live. And I know that you are, you mentioned Borgo Ignacio, which is one example, but you are in a way creating, operationalizing this, making it possible for blue zones to be created in other places. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that works?
I'm going to share my screen for just a second. This will be
Sure.
fast, but it's better to show my screen than it is to try to talk through it without. So here's the general idea. So every other approach would look at an individual like the one you see on the screen and say, all right, we're going to change that person's behavior. And we're going to change it by either incenting them with lower insurance rates, or we're going to educate that individual, or we're going to guilt that individual, or we're going to shake our finger at them. So it's your responsibility to get healthy. And Blue Zone's approach is, well, wait a minute. That individual is endowed with a genetic inclination to crave fat, sugar, salt, and take rest whenever they can. That's how that individual evolved for 25,000 generations of the human experience. And you aren't going to undo that. So instead of focusing on the individual, we more or less forget the individual and we go about engineering their environment. So again, the healthy choice is the easy choice. And the first thing we do when we come into a city is we interview the mayor, the city council, the CEOs, the principals of the school systems. And we show them our goal is to make the healthy choice the easy choice, which necessarily means we limit freedoms on doing unhealthy things. So a lot of cities say, whoa, we don't want to do that. But a majority of cities say, yes, we want to do it. And then we go out and we get private funding, usually from insurance companies or hospital systems or private foundations. And then for 5 years, I put a team together, and the team has 3 squads. The first is a people squad. And that team, depends on the size of the city. It could be anywhere from 1 to 10 people, but their job is to get 15% of the adult population to go into their homes with checklists to optimize their kitchen and the rest of their homes so the healthy choice is the easy choice. Remember those old ladies in Okinawa? We actually create moais in the cities we work with, and it actually works very well. We cluster people around values and interests and time, and then we challenge them to walk or to eat plant-based lunches together. So we re-engineer people's social networks, and then we give that 15% of people a purpose workshop and a curated volunteer opportunity, because a lot of people, most Americans actually do not get purpose at work. Fewer than 30% of Americans go to work and live their purpose. we're not going to tell people to quit their jobs. So we show them a volunteer opportunity that makes it easy for them. And by the way, we have cities that have over 1 million people. So our team will hit 150,000 people over the course of a 5-year period to make sure we get a critical mass of people involved. The second squad administers a Blue Zone certification program for grocery stores, workplaces, restaurants, schools, and churches. And they get certification by accomplishing certain milestones at changing designs and policies that nudge people into moving more naturally, eating less, socializing in a healthier way, and knowing and living their purpose. And there's a deep body of research on how to do it. It doesn't take a lot of work. And those of you with hotels out there, there's 115 things you could do to make your guest experience mindlessly healthier. And then we work with city government, and we have policy menus. Most of the policies are overlooked and easy to implement to make cities so that their policies favor healthy food, mostly fruits, vegetables, nuts, and beans, cheaper and more accessible than junk food, that favor the non-smoker over the smoker. This is the big one, that favor the pedestrian and the cyclist over the motorist. This is the number one way where you can get a city to move more. We can raise the physical activity level of an entire city by up to 30% by just making sure sidewalks are connected, there are bike lanes, there are trees, aesthetics are very important, parks are cleaned up, and there's a working public transportation system. And then we also have a alcohol bundle that finds the sweet spot between making sure people can enjoy themselves and alcohol is not abused. So we have people, places, and policies. And when we bring these three together, we orchestrate the perfect storm. There's somebody else's face besides me, but we orchestrate the perfect storm and make the healthy choice the easy choice. It may look like I shaved my head, but that's not me.
What? Oh no, that's you're just seeing other people on the screen. Okay, so that's incredible. So are you how are you now rolling that out? Are people coming to you and saying, we want our community to become a blue zone? And are you doing this globally?
No, I haven't done it globally yet. I would, but I'll tell you what, it's pretty hard. Over 400 American cities have come to me and asked us to do a blue zone. And, we can eventually scale to that level. I'm spending a lot of time building a team. We have about 200 full-time team members who deploy this. I have to be able to hire people for, like I said, 5 years, and that requires an office and management and so forth. And we're getting good at it. But in order for a city to qualify, we have to really have the buy-in. And a lot of times cities say, yeah, we want to do it. But then when we tell them, oh, you mean we actually have to limit the number of junk food restaurants and get rid of billboards in our city? We ask them to do things like that. And they say, well, that's not for us. So we eliminate them. And then there's a lot of cities that really want to do it, but we can't find the funding for that city to do it. So that eliminates them. So of the 470 cities that have asked us, we've only been able to work in 51 of them. All the cities we've worked in, we get Gallup to rigorously measure their obesity rate, their smoking rate, their diabetes rate, and their happiness, something called life satisfaction. And we only get paid, we put our fees at risk, let's say that, if the city gets measurably healthier and happier as measured by a third party. So to my knowledge, this is the only population intervention that has actually worked. In Fort Worth, Texas, a city of about 1 million people, we lowered the obesity rate by about 6%. We lowered the smoking rate by about 3%. And you say, well, big deal. That doesn't sound like much. But the reality is these little changes have occasioned about a $250 million a year savings for that city. So it's been an amazing return for them. And you know, we're better at doing it now than we were 5 years ago.
Dan, does playfulness, games, puzzles, doing those kinds of things, work on cognitive function, is that part of the everyday life in the Blue Zones? I know that, I'll just speak, you know, I have a family of game players and bridge players and crossword puzzlers, and they all lived into their late 90s and attribute a lot of their cognitive abilities to doing this and doing it in community. You know, bridge is a game for four. Is there play involved in the Blue Zones?
Yes. Especially in Mediterranean countries, you see this dominoes all the time. You know, the evidence is a little weak on the cognitive value of playing games. There's a lot of products that sort of tout it, but I think the big value of game playing is exactly what you alluded to, Nancy, and that is it's a reason for friends to come together, interact, and bond socially. And games is absolutely a Blue Zone activity, but probably not for the reasons you think. By the way, when it comes to cognitive sharpness, the number one best activity you can do is walk. We think of walking as so easy, but you engage over 200 muscles every time you take a step. And even though your brain's not thinking of those 200 muscles, your brain is making those 200 muscles work. And if you're holding a conversation with a friend at the same time, that's much more complex than we believe. So if you want to keep your brain sharp, get out and walk in nature. And eat a plant-based diet, by the way. It's huge.
Right, and take walks with the people that you like.
Yes, eating a carrot.
Right, while you're eating a carrot on a unicycle or something like that. There have been a number of questions, Dan, and you know, you'll get the chat so that you can see, and maybe you'll want to reach out. And there have been a number of questions related to COVID. I don't want to spend a ton of time there. We don't have a ton of time left, but you know, people are curious how, you know, are the people in the Blue Zones social distancing? You know, are they adhering to those kinds of guidelines, and how then does that, you know, really impact fundamentally what is so special about those places? So maybe you could just address that, and then we'll get to a couple of other things.
Well, the big thing to remember, people in Blue Zones are no different than us. They have except that, you know, if you're an American listening to me right now, their public health is much better than ours. So they're going to have a much more coordinated and orchestrated procedures around a pandemic than we in the United States are going to have. So they have that advantage. The better leadership, I would argue, at least when it comes to public health, bigger investment in public health, more direct interaction with people. So they're benefiting from that but you know, like I said before, this is an unstoppable disease at this point, and people are going to get it. It's just, you know, when they get it, and there's treatment for it.
Susie, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, Dan, thank you for all this. And I just wanted to mention that we are going to put a list of all of your books and a link to your presentation at our summit, and anything else you'd like us to share with our group, because I know a lot of people in the chat are asking for that. I have a question on now that you have, and maybe you can explain a little bit about, you've sold to Adventist. Is it an insurance company or a health company? Who are they, and what is going to happen now that this sale has taken place? Are you still involved? You know, we're just all curious because we're so excited about what has happened so far, and assuming that now even more will happen. We'd love to know about that.
Yes. So I'm a good innovator, and I'm good at coming up with new ideas and getting them off the ground. But I have no passion for operation or management. And this in Blue Zones grew to the point where I was spending way more time doing things I don't like than the things I do. The Adventist health system is a wonderful organization. First of all, they share Blue Zone's values. They're mostly Adventists, which is one of our Blue Zones. So they're plant-based, they're community-minded. They run 25 hospitals on the West Coast of the United States and down in Hawaii. And they are phenomenal at operating. And when you're running a hospital, you got people's lives. So they have very disciplined processes and procedures. And they've also made the very counterintuitive and bold step to, by the way, hospitals for the most part, they make their money when you get sick. They don't make money when you stay healthy and stay home. They make money when you, check into one of their beds and start buying, the services around that hospital stay. So they've made a very deep investment in keeping their communities where they have hospitals healthy in the first place, and a strategy at kind of expanding what they learn. And they did a worldwide search, and they came to us, the Blue Zones, and said, well, we want you to make our communities healthier. And after a year of talks, they realized that, it was better just to buy Blue Zones. So now when I say that, they didn't buy all Blue Zones. They took a majority stake in it. So I'm still involved. I'm involved for the next 5 years. I'm the founder, and it will always be my legacy. And it's the thing for which I'm most proud of. And also, I believe I will touch more lives in a positive way doing that than anything else I could go off and do. But my passion really is the exploration, the writing, the innovation. And this allows me to get rid of all the administrative and the headaches that go with running a business, and focus on my National Geographic work. So I just signed a 3-book deal with National Geographic, and I'm excited to get back in and do the investigations and really add to the science.
Thank you, Dan. And of course, I'm not sure you're going to tell me, but we'd love to know where that next Blue Zone is going to be. Can you give us a little hint?
Absolutely. It's wherever you are, Susie. Okay. Susie, if there's anybody in the world who's kind of a traveling Blue Zone, it's you. I know I feel better and want to live longer whenever I'm in your presence of you and the immediate group of people around you.
Nicely done, Dan. Very diplomatic.
We look forward to finding out.
I'm a reporter.
Also a diplomat. Very, very good. How about the next generation, the generations after in the Blue Zones? What about younger generations within we hear a lot about the elderly. What about the next generations growing up there?
I fear that most Blue Zones will disappear within about a generation, probably a half a generation. Okinawa is already almost gone. Costa Rica not far behind. The little bit better situation in Ikaria and among the Adventists, where these practices are more deeply ingrained. But the problem is once once the American food culture arrives in these places, it just obliterates the traditional way of eating, because Blue Zone, the food I write about in Blue Zone Kitchen is peasant food, but they make it taste delicious. But the flavors are subtle. They're not the napalm of a hamburger and fresh fry, taste bud napalm of hamburger and French fries and a pizza. And we evolutionarily are hardwired to, that tastes so good. It's like an orgasm in our mouth, and we get addicted to that kind of eating when it's cheap and it's ubiquitous. Even people in the Blue Zones are going to do what their environment dictates. Same thing with automobiles. As more and more pavement comes and cars come, and they see the way Americans got these, these electronic conveniences. Well, why should I talk to the old lady down the street when I can just text my friend and make a TikTok? So they're the same forces that is dismantling the longevity of many of our cultures listening today is also going to do the same in Blue Zone, sadly.
Is technology does it play a role at all it doesn't seem like technology is important at all in the blue zones? It has come up a number of times in the chat window. Technology at all, a question,
Yeah,
an
I'm going to be
issue?
disruptive on this. I know technology has provided great leaps for humankind, but it also is also occasioned regressions. The quality of social relationships have dropped dramatically in this country. The amount of time we move, our attention spans have diminished. Um, Technology is not nearly as ubiquitous in blue zones as they are here, and I hope it never becomes that way, because that will speed the erosion. Yes, technology is not going to make those people any happier or live any longer. Of course, young people want to pursue their dreams. They're attracted to the same, riches that people who live in Silicon Valley are attracted to. But the problem is, you're trading rhinestones for diamonds, I believe, when you adopt this a kind of empty promise of just pursuing wealth and progress for the sake of progress.
Dan, it seems that at this time in the world where people are, forced almost into a blue zone, if you will. I mean, they're cooking and eating at home. They're taking walks with their families. They're homeschooling. They're doing all these kinds of things by virtue of, being forced into these situations. And so there's an awareness that we're seeing, a momentum, a focus on these sort of simpler things, these fundamental elements of wellness and well-being throughout the world. So with 2 minutes left, I'm going to ask you what you feel. Do you feel optimistic in the world, and what you're feeling about that? What keeps you up at night? What are you worried about, and what are you hopeful about? And then we will unmute and wish you a great gratitude. But
thank you. I'm actually going bicycling right after this, but I think counterintuitively, I think this COVID is. Will, notwithstanding the pain and suffering of the families that have gotten COVID and have loved ones who've died, and respecting the sort of short-term pain of job loss, but I think it's a blessing for this earth. I think the fact that we've hit the pause button with this manic flying, using fossil fuels to fly and drive, the earth is getting a chance to breathe again. As I pointed out, at least in America, and I believe this is increasingly the case in the rest of the world, 70% of people don't like their jobs. So if there's 20% employment, in my opinion, for those 20%, that's an opportunity to take stock, visit their true sense of purpose, and then go out and maybe try something that lines up better. It's not worth working your whole life if you're never happy along the way. And for most people, some people have to work just to live, but that's a tiny minority in America anyway. I think it's an opportunity. If you're eating the standard American diet, it's shaving about 6 years off your life expectancy. The fact that we're locked down here and restaurants are closed, this is a beautiful opportunity to relearn the art of cooking at home. Every time you go out to eat, you consume about 300 more calories, and they tend to be sodium and fat-laden calories than if you just cooked at home. And by the way, cook with your family. Teach your kids how to cook. It's a great opportunity. You don't have to run off to work. And then finally, and this is the thing that shocked me, I was really kind of a very anti-technology when it comes to human connection. But I do believe that Zoom and FaceTime has afforded us the opportunity to connect. It's because we're in this slow down mode to connect with people we really love, old friends, and cement relationships. So I choose to look at to make lemonade out of these lemons, and to be optimistic about this disease. And I think we'll look back in 5 years and we'll say, yeah, actually it was a good reboot.
Dan, thank you so much. I think that, this has been, spending this time with you has been a great gift to all of us. And if Beatrice will unmute, and we will give you our global gratitude and a round of applause, and so much, many thank yous.
Thank you.
Oh, what a treat.
Thank you.
This has been a
Big hug.
love you guys.